Okay, hi everyone. Today discuss about the vector. The second video, which can be explained the only angle between the two vectors. How can we add the two vectors? Okay, these topics we can learn in this video. Okay, first of all, how the angle between the two vectors. Angle between the two vectors. Okay, first of all, angle between the two vectors. What is the vectors? We can notations we can explain. I will explain. See, this is the vector. Yes, this arrow indicating the we call it as a head, indicating the head. The end point of the other side is called as a tail. Is called as a tail. The arrow indicating the head, and the ending point of the other side is called as a tail. Okay, are you able to understand? By this using this head and tail, we can angle between the two vectors we can identify. Okay, first of all, let us consider two vectors. For example, a vector and b vector. A vector and b vector. What is the angle between the a bar and b bar? Okay, see, it's a bar vector. And next one, the angle must be angle between the two vectors, which is in the between the two tails or two heads. Okay, where the angle is forming either two tails or two heads. Here only angle can be forming where it is two tails of the two vectors. Tail of the a bar vector and tail of the b bar vector. Only in this case the angle can be between the two vectors. From these two vectors, the angle between the a bar and b bar. In another case, two heads also we can measure. Two heads also we can measure the angle between the two vectors. Are you able to understand? Either two tails or two heads between the two vectors, it's making an angle between the two vectors. See, two heads are two tails. And for example, if you want to write like this, a bar, okay, we want to write the b bar. It's not a angle between them. It's a wrong. Okay, only either tails or either heads must be makes an angle theta. Here only it can be forming head of the first vector and tail of the second vector. It's not a forming angle between the two vectors. That's why you need to understand carefully. Either tails or either heads makes an angle between the two vectors. For example, in this case, in this case, for example, we want to write like this: a bar. Okay, another vector will be there, b bar. For example, it's a 50 degrees is there. For example, 50 degrees. 50 degrees is the angle between the a bar and b bar. But the angle between the two vectors is not a correct. What is the angle between a bar and b bar? 50 is not a right answer. What is the we are discussing? Either tails or either heads between the two vectors makes an angle theta. That is the angle between the two vectors. But here only what happened? One head is there, one tail is there. Tail of the a bar vector, head of the b bar vector. Yes, it's not an angle. Then how can you find out the angle between the a bar and b bar? See, then what need to do? We can extending this line. We can extending this line. This is the head and this is the tail. What is the total angle? 180 degrees. Yes, already 50 degrees has completed. What is the remaining angle? 130 degrees is the angle between the two vectors. Angle between the two vectors. That 130 degrees is the angle between the two vectors. Are you able to understand? When you are extending this vector, here only tail. Are you able to understand? We can extend it. Total how much is there? 180 degrees. Already has completed 50 degrees. What is the remaining 180 minus 50? 130 degrees. That is the angle between the A bar and B bar vector. Okay, did you understand this one? That is the angle between the two vectors we can find out. One more thing, one more example I will explain. Okay, angle between the two vectors. Okay, next, for example, here only like this. Okay, here only like this. What is the angle between the two vectors? How can you say? For example, this is the angle 70 degrees. This is the B bar and this is the A bar vector. This is the A bar and this is the B bar vector. How can you find the angle between the two vectors? Is the correct answer 70 degrees? It's not, because always angle between the two tails or angle between the two heads. That is the angle between the two vectors. But here only 70 degrees, one tail of the B bar vector, head of the A vector. Yes, and it's not a 70 degrees is not a angle between the two vectors. Then what should we do here? We can parallel lines we can write. Yes, those are in parallel lines. Yes, sir. We can draw this one. Here only some angle is there, that is called as a angle between the two vectors. Why? Because of the dotted line shown. Those are in parallel lines. Yes, sir. Parallel. Parallel means here only 70. 70 degrees is the not a angle between the two vectors. When you draw the parallel lines, it's making an angle theta. This theta is nothing but an angle between the two vector. Angle between the two vector. How can you say? Actually 180 degrees total. 180 minus 70 will be completed. That is called as 120 degrees is the correct answer to, sorry, 110 degrees is the correct answer to angle between the two vectors. Actually, what happened here only? Already 70 degrees completed. Yes? Total 180. Already 70 has completed. What is the remaining angle? 110 degrees. That's a 110. Theta is equal to, here only 110 degrees is the correct answer. Okay. In this way, one example of the angle between the two vectors. Are you able to understand, or how can you find the angle between the two vectors? Okay, either tails or either heads between the two vectors makes an angle theta. That's called as an angle between the two vectors. And next one, how they add the two vectors, how they subtract the two vector. Adding of two vector, subtraction of the two vector. See. Addition of two vector. Addition of two vectors. Addition of two vectors. Okay, addition of two vector means by adding of two vectors. For example, this is the A bar vector. Okay. For example, this is the B bar vector. These two vectors we can add. How can we add? See, simply, that's a very important point you can learn. The first A bar, the first vector is, for example, A bar. Okay. The head of the first vector, is connected to the tail of the second vector. Head of the first vector is connected to the head of the first vector. Head of the first vector is connected to tail of the second vector. Tail of the second vector. Tail of the second vector means we can do this. That's a very important. The first one vector is A bar. Head of the first vector. Head of the first vector is connected to tail of the second vector. What is the tail here? B vector. This is the B bar. Are you able to understand? The head of the first vector is connected to the tail of the second vector. What is the resultant vector? That is the adding vector. That's a very important. Tail of the first vector is connected to head of the second vector. That is the resultant vector. That's a C bar. C bar is equal to what need to write? A bar plus B bar. A bar plus B bar. What is the second point? Tail of the first vector is connected to tail of the first vector is connected to head of the head of the second vector. Head of the second vector. Head of the second vector. That's called as a resultant vector. Means adding of two vectors. First of all, once again repeat. Head of the first vector is connected to the tail of the second vector. What is the head here? A bar vector is the first vector, for example. That is the head of the first vector and tail of the second vector. And resultant vector we can be add here. Tail of the first vector, head of the second vector. That's called as a adding of two vectors. Adding of two vectors. That is the C bar is equal to A bar plus B bar. Or otherwise, we can say, for example, B bar is a first vector. B bar is a first vector. And A bar is a second vector. But how can we add? See, A bar. So first B bar is a first vector. B bar is a first vector. First one, head of the first vector is connected to the tail of the second vector. Second vector means A bar. Tail which is connected here. That's a bar. What is the resultant vector? Tail of the first vector connected to head of the second vector. That's what we need to connect here. That's a C bar is equal to B bar plus A bar. B bar plus A bar. Which vector is first? That's what we can write here. In the previous one example, A bar plus B bar. But here only B bar plus A bar. That's called as a adding of two vectors. Adding of two vectors. Okay. From this, we want to learn some more concept that is called as a laws of vector addition. Laws of vector addition. Laws of vector addition.